I'm happy to introduce the last group, okay? And I'm going to tell us about eyes.
Eyes, yes. Super quick survey before we start. Who is good at putting in eye drops? Anyone good at putting in eye drops? Okay, so you're wrong, because eye drops are notoriously just really wasteful. Okay. So what we're examining is the possibility of taking an alternative to medicated eye drops, which would be medicated contact lenses. We're hoping that this would really, really increase the absorption rate into the eye in the areas that are needed, especially for diseases like glaucoma, which can cause blindness, which need really frequent medications if you're using eye drops, and human error and things like that obviously decrease the effectiveness by a lot. So that's kind of where this problem is most going to be applied to. So here's just a diagram of the eye. There we go. So what we're looking at is a contact lens here. And we have the cornea of the eye, which is going to be our target for drug delivery. And it's sitting between two layers. So you may remember this from Dan's presentation on Monday. But we're going to call this outer layer the pre-lens tear film, and the inner layer the post-lens tear film. So when we insert a contact, it kind of pushes the tear film into those two places. So when I say pre-lens, I'm going to mean the pre-lens tear film, and post-lens, I'll mean the post-lens tear film. And we're going to look at the dynamics of how the drugs can diffuse into those areas and hopefully into the brain. Our simplified diagram right here just kind of shows a model that will Our model will be similar to this in that we're just going to take the contact lens as this strip right here, look at the diffusion into the pre-lens and into the post-lens, and then have our cornea here, and hopefully we'll be, of course, having the medicated drug absorbed into the cornea area. So our starting point was this very simple model. We just took a diffusion equation right here, very simple, with the diffusion parameter D, which is established by literature of the diffusion from the drug out of the contact lens. And we're going to use C as our concentration of the drug, and it's going to be a function of space and time. So where is it concentrated over how long? H is going to be the height of our contact lens, and then we'll just use Z as our axis for establishing spatial dynamics. So here's a slightly more to scale model. It's still not quite to scale. The pre-lens tear film and the post-lens tear film are very, very, very thin compared to the contact lens. The contact lens is about 200 micrometers, and it is micro, right? And the pre-lens and post-lens are about 5. So there's quite a big difference in size there. So some assumptions that we're going to be making is that the contact lens begins with a uniform distribution of the drug, well mixed generally in all of our areas. We're going to say that the drug diffuses both into the post-lens and into the pre-lens for a time step about 0.05 seconds. It takes about 2 hours for all of the drug to completely diffuse out of the contact lens. And we're going to kind of introduce some of our non-dimensionalization terms in small chunks, so we're not all throwing them at once. But we're going to relate our time scale to a single blink, which is about 1/10 of a second. Our length is going to be scaled by both the width and the height. The width of a contact lens is in the order of centimeters, while the height, right, is about 200 micrometers. So there's quite a big difference there. Our concentration scale is just going to be the initial concentration ratio to that. So if we're looking at the pre-lens, a couple things happen during the blink in the pre-lens. So if you were to hold your eyes wide open for 5 minutes, they would completely dry out. So there is a bit of evaporation that happens in the pre-lens. this actually increases the concentration of the drug in that area. As the water evaporates, we assume that the drug does not, that it stays there. When we have a blink, then it's kind of completely refreshed. So everything is washed away by our blink, and the tear fluid is replenished after that. So we're taking our length scale and concentration scale, again, in relation to the height of the contact lens and the initial amount of concentration. So in the post lens, things happen a little bit differently. We're going to make the assumption that when we blink, the post lens contracts and fluid is able to travel out of the contact lens, but not into the cornea. So that's like part of the fluid loss, which can also happen in the pre-lens as well. So here is where we're getting into what our model really looks like. So if we look at just the contact lens, we're going to have our very nice, simple diffusion equation there, but we're going to up the complexity of our boundary conditions. We see that also we scaled the diffusion term in terms of one blink cycle and the height of the contact lens. So what this pretty much does is we're saying that, that the initial conditions, I'm sorry, a little problem with throat, that the boundary conditions for the pre and post lens are going to be related to K, some proportionality constant that we have assigned to the pre and post lens boundary conditions. The space that we'll be using here, starting at z equals 0 and then just adding each layer as we go up, is kind of going to be what we'll be seeing in terms of how we're going to define our space. So when we look at the pre-lens, we have some more complex conditions going on here. So first, let's take a look at the derivative of the height of the pre-lens with respect to time. This J term right here, we're taking that as kind of evaporation. So we're having the blink take away a certain, a large part of all of the tear fluid. And then this Gaussian function right here scales to allow a full blink cycle to restore everything back to where it was in terms of the height of the tear fluid. So this right here is the change in mass of the tear fluid. So it has several terms that determine exactly how the tear fluid is replenished for each blink. And we won't quite have time to go into a huge detail amount of how that goes. But we basically chose J to be a small constant. We chose a Gaussian function to represent that up and down cycle for the blink. So we would be able to represent that, well, reasonably accurately. And our pre as the drug lost when we blink and that outer layer compresses, it pushes the drug to other parts of the eye, not into our targeted area. For the post lens, we are looking at diffusion from the contact lens and diffusion into the cornea. So first, the change in height. When we blink, there's a force applied to our post lens, and that compresses it a bit. We're looking at the change in height here. This F term was derived using a nice little partial differential equation, and it just represents the force of compression during the blink. We have our Gaussian function again, and Kr is just our proportionality constant between the change of height in the post layer. The change in mass in the post layer, again, is done by taking a look at this term here when this derivative is positive. When that derivative is negative, we're just going to say that it's 0. So when there's a negative change in the height of the post lens, we don't count it. We're only looking at kind of the rebound effect. So when it's compressed, how does it replenish throughout the blink cycle? And we want it to kind of happen fast at first, so that post-lens area, post-lens height gets large kind of quickly, but then slows down a bit. That was kind of what we were going for with this model.
And this is what you're most interested in, right? You want the drug to go into the cornea.
Exactly, yes. We very much want the drug to go into the cornea. And so this really tells us of the amount that gets diffuses into the post layer, how much can then go into the cornea. Okay, so our results. So what we are looking at here is just a short cycle of 20 blinks. We're assuming that we blink about once every 5 seconds. And we can see that for these first 20 blinks, that the concentration in the contact lens stays pretty steady towards the middle. 0 is going to be the boundary to the post lens. 1 is going to be the boundary to the pre-lens. And then this 1 is just going to be our height of the contact lens. Or of the amount, of diffusion. 1 being the total amount of the drug in the contact lens. So we can see that this is asymmetrical, that there is more diffusion happening on the boundary of the pre-lens. And we can say that this is because of a mechanism in the blink cycle, that perhaps it's because all of the drug gets washed away when we blink and has to replenish with tear fluid. But that's something that would be interesting to investigate further, is the reasons why the diffusion rate is so much higher, so much higher at the pre-lens boundary. So this is that same dynamic, but over a much larger time scale, about 1,200 blinks. We can see that it approaches 0 almost by then. It's exponentially heading towards 0, so it doesn't quite ever get there. But we can see too that it's again asymmetrical and it's diffusing a lot more on the pre-lens border. All right, so some more results. If we take a look at the pre-lens first, this is going to be the thickness of the pre-lens, how that varies with each blink, and the concentration of drugs in the pre-lens and how that varies with each blink. So notice that in the pre-lens, the thickness stays pretty steady. The evaporation that occurs out of the pre-lens is pretty slow compared to a blink cycle. So there's not too much of water loss during the evaporation phase. But during the blink phase, it it eliminates nearly all of the drug, right? A huge amount of the drug is lost every time we blink, and it kind of resets down to here. However, it's kind of the opposite dynamic in the post lens. In the post lens, the thickness changes and varies a lot more during each blink, right? As it's compressed and then as it a little more slowly rebounds to its original thickness, but the concentration of the drug is a lot more steady. And of course, again, this is just over a short time scale for the first couple minutes that after you apply the contact lens. So for a longer time scale, this is kind of what it looked like. Now, these are not solid, they're just very, very numerous oscillations. So we can see that the thickness in the pre-lens pretty much stays the same, which would be consistent with what's here, right? It's just small oscillations. In the post lens, we have that varied behavior, oscillating up and down and up and down and up and down, but it still stays within that band pretty consistently. What's interesting is the decrease in concentration. So in the pre-lens, it's decreasing much more quickly, right? It goes to 0 as the drug diffuses out. And that is consistent with the previous results of that asymmetrical diffusion rate we have for the pre-lens compared to the post-lens. So the post-lens is a little bit more steady in the loss of the drug. So it's it's just a little, it's still, going down to 0 as the drug diffuses out of the contact lens over time. But there's a lot less loss. Okay, so taking a look at this is kind of looking at how much of the drug actually makes it to the cornea, which is what we want. So on the left-hand side, we see the total amount of the drug in the system. So 100% of the drug and how it is lost various ways. So loss can occur by being absorbed into the cornea, which is what we want, or by lateral movement, or any other factor that causes the drug to go anywhere but the cornea after it diffuses out of the contact lens. And as a note too, we decided there's nothing diffusing back into the contact lens. All the drug does is diffuse out and it goes somewhere. So if we look at from the right-hand side axis here, the proportion delivered into the cornea. So we see initially it oscillates quite a bit, and it goes up to this proportion here, which is not ideal. 10 to 12% makes it into the cornea. Still better than eye drops, right? So that's good. But if we look at a longer cycle and how the dynamics change, over 1,200 blinks, we see that as the drug diffuses out of the contact lens and approaches 0, that the amount that is delivered to the cornea eventually reaches about 18% there. So that's pretty decent, and it is consistent with the literature that we've been reading. So we're happy with those results. So we varied some parameters here, and if we had a lower force that was being applied during those blink phases, then we're actually going to get a higher absorption rate into the cornea. So that's going to be up around 25%. So if we could find a way to physically do that, that would be great. But generally, it was an interesting result that less force applied to the post lens is going to give us a higher absorption rate of drugs into the cornea. Okay, so to summarize our basic points, we made our simple model, right, for the pre-lens and the post-lens. We captured the main dynamics of what we thought were the most important aspects of the blink cycle and how that affected diffusion. Our numerical solutions confirmed that there is quite a bit of the drug that escapes during this time frame, which is, I think I said, about 2 hours for the drug to diffuse completely out of the contact lens. So, right, 80% still flushed out, not great. Still better than eye drops, which is like way up there in the high 90s, that just goes nowhere. So in the future, we would want to investigate our analytic solution a little bit more. We were able to find an analytic solution for the diffusion problem in the contact lens with those given boundary conditions, but we didn't use that too much in our visualizations. So one interesting track would be to examine that more and see where that would lead us. One thing we also didn't account for is the lateral movement of the contact. So when you blink, it actually, the contact moves down a little bit, and opening it up moves your eye back up. So what does that have an effect of how the drug is delivered? And also the Gaussian function that we were using to kind of mimic that flow of the blinks, we could replace that with a delta function, and that would change the coding quite significantly, but it would be interesting to see how that would change the model. Our lovely references, which I'm sure you'll want to read really carefully. These are just what we used in the presentation with some of our numbers and initial figures and numeric values. But that is pretty much it. Thank you.